The year was 1912, and I was 10 years old, a skinny wisp of a boy named Finn with knees perpetually scraped and a head full of stories. Most of my stories came from my Granny May, who claimed she'd seen a hobgoblin once, and some came from the dusty books Pa kept in his study, full of knights and dragons. But the best ones, the ones that felt real, came from the air itself, from the way the light fell through the stained glass windows of St. Rose Church, or the smell of old wood and beeswax that clung to its ancient stones. St. Rose wasn't just a building. It was the steady beat of our small town, Willow Creek, nestled deep in a valley so quiet you could hear the whispers of the wind through the pines. Every Sunday, rain or shine, hot or cold, the bells of St. Rose would call us. Their deep, resonant clang would roll over the gentle hills, across the patchwork fields, and down into the sleepy hollows where our farms lay. It was a sound that meant community, meant warmth, meant the familiar faces of our neighbors all gathered, under the watchful eye of God and Father Michael. Father Michael wasn't old like Granny May, but his hair was thin, and his face was kind, lined with the years he'd spent listening to confessions and leading hymns. He had a way of making even the dullest biblical tale sound like a grand adventure, and his sermons, though sometimes long, always left you thinking, like a pebble dropped into a deep well. My own place on Sundays was usually squished between my ma, Ilara, who smelled of lavender and fresh-baked bread, and my pa, Thomas, whose hands, when they weren't holding a plow, could carve the most intricate little wooden birds. Our pew was the third from the front on the right, worn smooth, by generations of elbows and knees. From there I had a perfect view of the altar, draped in white linen, and the large wooden cross that hung behind it, dark and solemn. The air in St. Rose was always cool, even on the hottest summer days, carrying the scent of candle wax and the faint, sweet smell of the lilies that Mrs. Gable, the florist, always brought from her garden. The sunlight, when it managed to peek through the heavy clouds, would explode into 1,000 colors as it hit the stained glass window above the altar, making the figures of saints and angels dance in vibrant hues across the floor. That summer, though, felt different. It was the summer the whispers started, not from Granny May, but from the grown-ups, hushed and quick. It wasn't about a hobgoblin or a dragon. It was about Father Michael. He had always been a man of robust health, his voice strong and clear. But lately, his sermons had grown quieter, his movements a little slower. He'd pause sometimes in the middle of a prayer, his eyes unfocused, as if listening to a distant, unheard melody. Ma would say he was just tired, burdened by the worries of the flock, but Pa would shake his head, a thoughtful frown etched on his face. "It's more than tiredness, Ilara," he'd murmur one evening, after I was supposed to be asleep but was listening from my bed. "There's a change in him, like a candle burning down too fast." The Sunday before everything happened, it was a perfectly ordinary day on the surface. The sun was bright, the air warm and still. The bells rang out their familiar summons, and we all gathered, filling the pews, our voices rising in unison for the opening hymn. Yet something felt off. Father Michael's hands, usually steady as he raised the chalice, trembled slightly. His eyes, though still kind, held a distant, almost haunted look. He preached his sermon on perseverance, on faith in the face of unseen trials, but his voice lacked its usual booming conviction. It was softer, almost a plea, and I found myself leaning forward, trying to catch every word, trying to understand the unspoken weight in his voice. The strangest thing happened during the collection. Deacon Silas, a portly man with a booming laugh that usually filled the church with cheer, was passing the collection plate. As he walked past our pew, his hand brushed against mine. His skin was unnaturally cold, like river water in the middle of winter, and I pulled my hand back instinctively. He didn't seem to notice, his eyes fixed ahead, his face unusually pale. Later, when I told Ma, she just said he must have been standing by an open door, catching a draft. But I knew. It wasn't a draft, it was something else. A cold that seeped from within. That week, the feeling of unease deepened. The nights grew unnaturally quiet. The crickets, usually a ceaseless chorus outside my window, fell silent, and even the hoot of the owl seemed muffled, distant. A strange mist, thick and clinging, began to roll in from the valley most evenings, wrapping Willow Creek in a damp, silent shroud. It wasn't like the usual morning fogs that burned off with the sun. This mist lingered, a ghostly presence that made the outlines of familiar trees seem blurred and indistinct. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something else, something I couldn't quite place, a sweet, cloying odor that was almost sickly. Pa was out late more nights than usual, checking on his fields. He said the mist wasn't good for the crops, encouraging, blight. But I saw the way he'd look up at the sky, his brow furrowed, his gaze searching the swirling gray. He wasn't just worried about the wheat. He was worried about something else, something he wouldn't name. The other farmers, men who usually gathered at the general store to swap jokes and gossip, were quieter too. Their conversations clipped, their eyes shifting nervously towards the mist-shrouded hills. On Saturday, the day before the last sermon, I went down to the river to skim stones. The water was usually clear, its surface reflecting the blue of the sky. But that day, it was sluggish, a dark, bruised green, and the surface was covered with a strange, oily film that shimmered in the weak sunlight. A few dead fish, their bellies, pale, floated listlessly by the bank. I poked one with a stick. It was cold and stiff. My stomach churned. The river, our lifeblood, felt sick. It felt wrong. That evening, as the mist began to creep in again, thicker than ever, Father Michael came to our house. He rarely did, usually staying within the confines of the rectory. He stood on our porch, his figure almost swallowed by the swirling gray, his face pale and drawn. He didn't come in. He just spoke to Pa in low tones, his voice a strained whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I saw Ma's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Pa's face was grim. After a moment, Father Michael nodded slowly, turned and disappeared back into the clinging mist, a ghostly silhouette swallowed by the swirling gray. "What was that, Pa?" I asked, my voice small, trembling. Pa just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the spot where Father Michael had vanished. "Nothing, son," he said, his voice flat. "Just Father Michael's burdens. He carries them heavy." But I knew it wasn't nothing. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken dread. The silence of the night outside was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a profound, waiting stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Tomorrow was Sunday. Tomorrow was the sermon. And for the first time in my life, I felt a chilling certainty that St. Rose, our beautiful, unchanging church, was about to be the stage for a story unlike any Granny May or Pa's books had ever told. A story that would change Willow Creek forever. A story about a sermon that would be remembered not for its words, but for its silence. And for the 12 parishioners who never left. The mist outside thickened, wrapping our house in a cold, damp embrace, and I shivered, not from the cold, but from the premonition of what the morning would bring. The morning of the last sermon dawned not with a bang, but with a profound, suffocating stillness. The mist, which had been a creeping shadow for days, now held Willow Creek in a thick, silent embrace. It clung to the eaves of our house, swallowed the outlines of the fence posts, and made the distant tree line disappear entirely. It was a world of gray and muffled sound, where the familiar sights and sounds of our town had been erased, replaced by a sense of unreality. Even the bells of St. Rose, our town's faithful heartbeat, did not ring out their usual call. The silence was absolute, a profound, waiting stillness. Ma, her face pale and drawn, moved about the kitchen with a quiet purpose, making our usual Sunday breakfast of eggs and fried potatoes. But the smell of the food, usually a comforting presence, felt strange, out of place in the unnerving quiet. Pa, his jaw set in a grim line, sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his eyes distant. The conversation he had with Father Michael the night before hung in the air between them, a silent, unspoken weight. I ate my breakfast in silence, my stomach a knot of fear and apprehension. The world felt wrong, and St. Rose, the place where everything was always right, was our only hope of finding a way back to normal. Our walk to the church was a strange, disquieting journey. The cobbled lane was slick with mist, and the houses we passed were dark, their windows like blind, empty eyes staring out into the gray. The usual cheerful Sunday greetings were absent. Only a few other families were making their way through. The mist, their figures appearing and disappearing like ghosts. I counted them in my head as we walked. Deacon Silas, his wife, Margaret, and their son Jasper, a boy a few years older than me. Mrs. Gable, the florist, a small hunched figure, her face a mask of solemn reverence. The Miller family, 2 brothers, and their wives, their sturdy frames a familiar comfort in the gloom. And finally, the old widow, Agnes, a woman whose face was a road map of wrinkles, her faith as old as the hills themselves. 12 people, including my own family, all drawn by the silent, unseen call of St. Rose, all walking toward a sermon that would change our world forever. The church itself, when we finally reached it, was not the grand, welcoming beacon of light I knew. It was a cold, gray presence, its stone walls almost swallowed by the mist. The great oak doors were open, but there was no light spilling out, no familiar chorus of voices. The air inside was cold and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and the sickly sweet odor of the mist. The pews, which were usually filled to the brim, were mostly empty. We, the 12 parishioners, made a small, quiet island of humanity in a vast, cold sea of emptiness. Father Michael stood at the altar, his back to us, his body a frail, hunched figure against the large, dark wooden cross. He did not turn as we entered, did not acknowledge our presence. He just stood there, a silent, solitary figure, his hands clasped, his head bowed. His silence was more powerful, more terrifying than any words could ever be. He finally turned, to face us, his face a pale, gaunt mask. His eyes, usually kind and warm, were now glassy and distant, filled with a look of profound, terrible sorrow. He began his sermon not with a prayer, but with a question. "Why do we seek comfort in this house of stone?" he whispered, his voice a frail, reedy thing that seemed to be fighting to be heard. "When the truth is out there, in the quiet places, in the unseen things." He spoke of sacrifice, not of the simple, everyday sacrifices of a simple life, but of a grand, final, and absolute sacrifice, a sacrifice that was the only true path to salvation. His words were strange, disjointed, filled with a mournful poetry that made no sense. He spoke of the river, of the mist, of the silence of the night, not as things to be feared, but as messengers, as harbingers of a great and terrible truth. That was about to be revealed. As he spoke, a change came over the parishioners. Deacon Silas, his cold hands folded, his eyes fixed on Father Michael, his face a mask of silent, rapt attention. Mrs. Gable, the florist, her hunched body now straight and rigid, her face a pale, unmoving statue. The Millers, their sturdy frames now perfectly still, their eyes glassy and distant. Even Lyra, my sister, who was usually fidgeting in her seat, was a silent, unmoving statue, her small hand clutching Ma's hand, but her gaze fixed on the altar, on Father Michael. They were all there, the 12 of them, an island of stillness, in a sea of emptiness. I looked at my mother and father, Ma, her face filled with a terror that was as deep as any I had ever seen, her hand still clutched by Lyra's. Pa, his jaw set in a grim line, his eyes moving from Father Michael to the 12 parishioners, a terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. He was a man of the earth, a man who saw the world in simple, practical terms, but even he could not deny the profound, terrifying unreality of the moment. Father Michael's sermon reached a crescendo. He raised his hands, his body trembling with the effort, his voice a frail, desperate plea. "We are all seeking a final resting place," he whispered, his eyes sweeping over the silent, unmoving parishioners. "And today, in this house of stone, we will find it. This is the last sermon at St. Rose. For the 12 of you, this is the final journey, the final sacrifice, the final truth." He let his hands fall, and a silence, so profound and so absolute, fell over the church that it seemed to swallow all sound, all light, all hope. The 12 parishioners sat in their pews, unmoving, their eyes fixed on Father Michael. They were there, but they were not there. They were there, but they had already left. The last sermon at St. Rose was over, and the 12 parishioners, the 12 silent, unmoving figures, were gone. They had never left. And in the silent, cold emptiness of the church, I knew that the story of Willow Creek, the story of my life, had been forever changed, a story that was now a silent, terrifying question that would haunt us for the rest of our days. The silence that followed Father Michael's last words was not the peaceful quiet of a finished prayer. It was a thick, oppressive nothingness that pressed down on our ears, a silence so profound it felt like a living thing. The air, which had been heavy with unspoken dread, now felt heavy with a terrible finality. We were all still, frozen in our seats, but unlike the 12 parishioners, our stillness was born of shock, not of whatever had happened to them. Their eyes were open, fixed on the empty space where Father Michael had stood, but they saw nothing. Their hands were folded in their laps, their posture perfectly serene, as if they were in a state of deep, undisturbed slumber, a slumber from which they would never wake. Pa was the first to move. He was a man of the earth, a man who believed in action over words, and his mind, even in the face of this impossible reality, was searching for a solution. He stood up, his chair scraping on the stone floor, a sound that felt deafening in the silence. He walked toward Deacon Silas, his movements cautious, almost reverent. He knelt beside him, and with a gentle hand, he touched the deacon's shoulder. "Silas?" he murmured, his voice a low, questioning rumble. There was no response. Pa shook him, a little more firmly this time, but the deacon's body remained still, his eyes glassy and vacant. He was there, but he was not there. Ma, her face a mask of pure terror, stood up, her hand pulling me close to her side. "Thomas, what is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What has he done?" She was looking at Father Michael, who now stood by the altar, his back to us, his head bowed. He was not praying. He was in a state of perfect, serene stillness, a stillness that was both peaceful and deeply unsettling. His body was a study in profound, terrible calm, a stillness that was a mirror to the stillness of the 12 parishioners. Pa moved from Deacon Silas to Mrs. Gable, a small, hunched figure in the second row. He touched her. Her skin was cold, a chill that was unnatural, a chill that was colder than the mist that had hung over our town. Her eyes, open and unblinking, were fixed on the altar, her face a serene mask, a woman who had found a peace that was not of this world. Pa moved from one to the other, a small, desperate figure in a sea of statues, his movements a testament to his love, his hands shaking with a fear that was more powerful than any he had ever known. He was a man of the earth, a man who saw the world in simple, practical terms, but this was a reality that defied all reason, a reality that was a wound in the very fabric of our world. As Pa moved among the parishioners, a new sound, a faint, almost inaudible humming, began to fill the church. It was a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very stones of the building, a sound that was both a vibration and a melody, a sound that seemed to be speaking to the deepest parts of our souls. I looked around, my young eyes searching for a source, and I saw a faint, otherworldly glow coming from the large wooden cross behind the altar. It was a soft, pale light, a light that was not of this world, a light that seemed to be speaking to the stillness of the 12 parishioners, a silent, powerful conversation that we could not understand. Suddenly, a new and terrible thought struck me. Where was Father Michael? He was no longer at the altar. He was gone, a silent phantom in the silent church. I turned to Ma, my voice a small, terrified whisper. Ma, where's Father Michael? She looked at me, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of terror. He was gone. He had not just led the last sermon at St. Rose. He had left, leaving us alone in a church of 12 silent statues and a terrifying, otherworldly light. Pa, his face a mask of grief and despair, returned to us, his body shaking with a profound, terrible cold. They're gone, Ilara, he said, his voice a low, tortured whisper. They're all gone. He had tried to rouse them, to bring them back from the abyss, but they were in a place that no human hand could touch, a place of silent, unmoving stillness, a place that was not of this world. He looked at us, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love. We have to go, he said, his voice firm, his body a testament to his enduring will to live. We have to leave them. We moved from the pew, our movements a small, frantic dance in the vast, cold emptiness of the church. We were the only ones moving. We walked past the 12 silent, unmoving figures, their faces a serene, beautiful testament to a peace that was both a promise and a terrifying final end. We walked past the empty altar, past the glowing cross, and to the great oak doors of the church. I looked back, my young eyes filled with a terror that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my days, at the 12 silent, unmoving figures in the pews, an island of stillness in a sea of emptiness. They were there, but they had already left. The last sermon at St. Rose was over, and the 12 parishioners had found their final resting place, a place that was not of this world, a place that we, the survivors, would spend the rest of our days trying to understand. The silence of the church, once a comfort, was now a constant, terrifying question, a question that we would never be able to answer, a question that was our new reality. The mist had been our quiet companion for days, a soft gray presence that had softened the edges of our world. But as we stumbled out of the great oak doors of St. Rose, it was no longer a companion. It was a suffocating shroud. It was cold and damp, and it smelled of wet earth and a sickly sweet scent I still couldn't place. It clung to our clothes, our hair, our skin, a palpable weight that made it hard to breathe. The town, which had been a quiet huddle of homes in the morning, was now a silent, ghostly tableau. The houses were dark, their windows like blind, empty eyes staring out into the swirling gray. The silence was absolute, a profound, terrifying nothingness that pressed down on our ears, a silence that screamed of a world that had ended. We walked home in a daze, our movements slow and clumsy. Ma held me tight, her hand a fierce, desperate grip on my arm. Lyra, my sister, was a small, silent weight on her other side, her head buried in my mother's coat. Pa, his jaw set in a grim line, his hand on my mother's back, was a silent, unmoving sentinel. We were a small, fragile island, of life in a vast, desolate sea of silence, our feet the only sound in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. The cold, wet mist clung to us, a constant reminder of the horror we had just left behind, a horror that was now an invisible presence in our home, in our town, in our lives. Our house, when we finally reached it, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cold, silent tomb. We closed the door behind us, a small, futile act of defiance against a world that had become impossibly vast and terrifying. We were alone. The phone lines were dead, the phone a silent, useless relic in a world that had no use for it. The radio, Pa's constant companion, was a dead box of wood and wire, a silent testament to a world that was no longer listening. We were cut off, isolated, a small family in a small town that had been erased from the map. The mist outside thickened, wrapping our house in a cold, damp shroud, a shroud that seemed to be sealing us in, a shroud that seemed to be protecting us from a world that had become a mystery we could not solve, a horror we could not escape. Pa, a man who believed in action, over despair, was already at the window, his eyes scanning the mist-shrouded street. He was not looking for survivors. He was looking for a solution, a path forward in a world that had no path. He turned to Ma, his face a mask of grief and despair. "I have to go back," he said, his voice a low, tortured whisper. Ma's protest was immediate, a sharp, choked gasp of terror. "No, Thomas, no! You can't! You saw what happened! It's not safe!" But Pa just shook his head. "They're still there, Alara," he said, his eyes meeting hers, a fierce, unwavering light in their depths. "They're still there. I have to know what happened. I have to find a way to bring them back. I have to get them out." He was not just speaking of the 12 parishioners. He was speaking of the heart of our community, a heart that had been torn out and left in a cold, silent church. Ma, her face a mask of grief and terror, shook her head, her quiet sobs a painful counterpoint to the silence of the world outside. "What are you going to do?" she cried, her voice a desperate plea. "What can you do against that?" She pointed a trembling finger at the window, at the swirling, suffocating mist that was a silent, malevolent presence in our world. "What can one man do against the unknown?" Pa had no answer. He just looked at her, his face a mask of profound sadness. A man who was walking into a fight that he knew he could not win, but a man who had to fight anyway. Just as he was about to leave, I saw something. In the weak gray light of the morning, a faint, almost invisible glimmer on the stone path outside the church doors. I had seen it before, but in my terror I had not registered its meaning. It was a strange, intricate symbol, a symbol I had never seen before, a symbol that was carved into the cold stone of the church. It was not a religious symbol, not a cross, not a chalice, but a series of intertwined lines that seemed to have no beginning or no end, a silent, beautiful, and terrifying enigma. I ran to the window, my small hand pounding on the glass. "Pa!" I cried, my voice a small, terrified gasp. "Pa! Look! On the path! There's a sign!" Pa came to the window, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. He looked out, his eyes scanning the path, and he saw it. The symbol, a silent, glowing testament to a reality that was not of this world, a reality that was a wound in the very fabric of our lives. He looked at the symbol, his face a mask of uncomprehending terror. And then he looked at me, his eyes filled with a new, a more profound kind of fear, a fear that was not for himself, but for us. He was not just going back to a church of silent statues. He was going back to a place of dark and terrible secrets, a place that had claimed 12 souls, a place that was now marked with a sign of its victory. The last sermon at St. Rose was over, but the story of what had happened, the story of what was to come, was just beginning. A story that was now a silent, terrifying question. A question that was our new reality. Pa turned, his face a mask of grim determination, and with a last, long look at us, he disappeared into the suffocating mist, a single, brave figure walking into a world that had been changed forever. The hours that followed Pa's disappearance into the mist were the longest of my life. Our house, which had been a sanctuary against the storm, was now a small, fragile vessel adrift in a sea of silence. The silence was not peaceful. It was a living, breathing thing that pressed down on our eardrums, filling every corner of our home with a heavy, unspoken dread. My mother, Ilara, was a statue of grief and despair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the closed front door as if waiting for a ghost to return. Lyra, my sister, was a small, silent presence, her head buried in a blanket on the floor, her body trembling with a quiet, persistent fear. We were a small, lonely island of life in a vast, desolate sea of silence, our hearts a frantic, desperate rhythm against the terrifying stillness. The mist, which had been our quiet companion for days, was now an enemy. It swirled outside our windows, a thick, suffocating gray presence that seemed to have a life of its own. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, a silent, malevolent spirit that had claimed our town and our lives. I found myself drawn to the window, my face a cold mask of terror, watching the mist's silent, slow dance. I saw it move from our yard to the lane, and then, with a strange, deliberate purpose, it began to thicken around St. Rose. The church, our town's faithful heartbeat, was now a silent, ghostly presence in the swirling gray, a monument to a world that had ended. The air in our house, thick with the scent of old wood and Ma's fear, was a painful contrast to the smell of the mist outside, a sickly sweet odor that was a cruel and constant reminder of the horror we had just escaped. I tried to be brave. I tried to be Pa. I moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose, just as he would have. I checked the doors, the windows, making sure they were locked. A small, futile act of defiance against a world that had no use for locks. I made sure the fire was still burning in the hearth, its small, flickering light a fragile beacon in the immense darkness of our fear. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. I was just a boy, and the world had become a place that I did not understand, a place that was far more vast and terrifying than any story Pa had ever told me. Ma finally moved. She stood up, her body a pale, trembling shadow in the gloom. She went to the window, her gaze fixed on the mist. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice a small, desperate plea. "He has to be." But even as she said the words, her eyes were filled with a terrible, profound fear. She was a woman of deep faith, a woman who believed in the power of God and the goodness of man. But what had happened at St. Rose was not of God, and it was not of man. It was of a world that she did not understand, a world that was a wound in the very fabric of our lives. Suddenly, I saw it. A new detail, a detail that was more terrifying than any I had seen before. I moved to the other window, the one that faced the garden, and there, in the swirling gray of the mist, I saw it. A single, small, familiar plant that had sprung up overnight. It was a lily, the kind Mrs. Gable always brought to the church, but it was not ordinary. It was a deep, sullen red, the color of blood, and it pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. I had not seen it before. It had not been there when we had left for church. It was a testament to a world that was a new and terrifying reality, a world where the flowers had a new color and a new, more sinister purpose. I ran to Ma, my small hand pulling at her skirt. "Ma, look!" I cried, my voice a small, terrified. Gasp. "The flowers in the garden! They're glowing!" Ma looked at me, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of terror. She turned to the window and saw it, the single, glowing red lily, a small, beautiful, and terrifying beacon in the suffocating gray. She covered her mouth with her hand, her quiet sob a painful counterpoint to the silence of the world outside. The mist had not just taken our community, it had remade it. Just as the sun began its slow descent, a new sound, a different sound, broke the terrible silence. It was a low, mournful, and rhythmic humming, the same sound I had heard in the church, but now it was outside, in the mist. It was a sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that was a melody and a vibration, a sound that seemed to be speaking to the deepest parts of our souls. We all froze, our bodies a small knot of terror in the vast, cold emptiness of our home. The humming grew louder, and then from the swirling gray of the mist, a figure appeared. It was not a man, and it was not a ghost. It was a tall, shrouded presence, its face hidden by the swirling mist, its form a dark, looming shadow in a world of silent death. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, a silent, malevolent phantom, and in its hand it carried a long, winding vine of the glowing red lilies. It moved toward our house, a silent, terrifying messenger from a world that had become a mystery we could not solve, a horror we could not escape. And as I looked at the figure, I knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that it was not Pa. It was a new presence in our town, a new and terrible chapter in our story. The last sermon at St. Rose was over, but the story of what had happened, the story of what was to come, was just beginning, a story that was now a silent, terrifying question, a question that was our new reality.